The professor could have just set the exam and said, "Oh, we're done. You've got the content now. You get the idea." But the gift that I think he did for the class was he distilled all of that research into a single phrase. And the phrase is, put yourself at risk of productive accidents as a piece of career advice or life advice. Put yourself in a situation where something interesting might happen. And it could be luck comes your way. It could be serendipity. It could be happenstance. It could be productive accidents or happy accident, whatever you want to call it. And that resonated with me immediately because it turns out I'd already been doing that over the past number of years. So it gave me the vocabulary to describe something that I'd already started.
Peter, thanks very much for joining. Where does this podcast find you?
I am based in Singapore. And strangely, I moved to Singapore from Sydney pretty much 25 years ago, which sounds bizarre because I'm only 30. But, but we've spent half the time in Hong Kong and half in Singapore. So twice in Singapore, like up and back and so on.
And your story strikes me as one of, and you framed it around the adventure factory, productive accidents, always seeing possibility. And I find that really refreshing when it comes to Singapore in particular, because I've been to Singapore, I really like it. But the common knock on Singapore is you kind of run out of things to do after a while because it's so self-contained, etc. But
Yeah.
I suspect with your perspective, you haven't run into that barrier because of your embrace of productive accidents.
Actually, no, I did exactly run into that barrier. When we first moved here, it was a month after September 11, and we came in with a 3-year-old, and we thought we were going to stay for 2 years, and we thought we'd go back, and our daughter Isabella would start school in Australia at 5 years of age. But it made no sense to go back just because of her starting preschool or whatever, right? So we ended up staying 4, 6, 8, 9 years. But I was bored after 3 years. And maybe that was the earlier phase of Singapore. It felt like my brain was turning to mashed potato, and you had to leave Singapore to engage with the real world to see, what's really going on. Because it's a little bit like Disneyland, it's a little bit too pristine back then in particular. It's changed because, we were here for 9 years. In 2010, we moved to Hong Kong, stayed there for 12. And Hong Kong's definitely edgier, as a concept. And we came back, and I was reluctant to move back to Singapore. I was expecting like a 3 out of 10 experience. But fortunately, one small shift in our lifestyle took it to an 8 out of 10 quite quickly. The thing that changed things was the first time we lived in Singapore, we did not have a motorbike license. Having a Vespa made Singapore suddenly feel like Hong Kong because there was no barrier to going and doing stuff, and the speed of life accelerated. Like every day I just jump on the Vespa and I can go to tennis at 7 a.m., like literally this morning. Then I come home, I took my wife into work. We have this great little route. We go down Orchard Road, we turn right, we go past the Marina Bay on the left, and we've got the Fullerton Hotel on the right. And I do this signal each day. I go 1, 2, 3 with my fingers, and then we both let out this massive woohoo. And the people walking across that bridge must be freaking out, going, what the hell is going on? The people in the cars, I don't know if they hear it, but it's just a nice little celebration. And it's not always as joyful as it sort of sounds, because for a while there, careers go up and down, right? It's a roller coaster and life goes up and down. But we do it anyway. And when things are good, you really appreciate that little woohoo celebration, because I always smile off the back of it. I smile for the next 2 or 3 blocks. And that's a good way to start the day. And I do find riding the Vespa is my version of mindfulness. It's like you have to be in the moment. You can't be thinking about what happened yesterday or last year or what's going to happen 2 years from now, because you have to be looking, 180 degrees of peripheral vision, looking for people doing silly things. And it could be pedestrians, it could be cars, it could be motorbikes, it could be pets, it could be anything. And I usually have one AirPod in an ear, playing some music. And I have a pretty active Spotify playlist, and I'm always listening to new music. And again, that just puts you in the zone. And yeah, it's been like it took it literally from a 3 out of 10 to an 8 out of 10. And then a couple of other things happened. We managed to find a place to live. This was in middle of 22 when there were a lot of people leaving, like Hong Kong and China, Shanghai, etc., and moving to Singapore because just it provided more certainty and a bit more flexibility around travel and all that sort of things. Because Hong Kong made a meal of COVID, unfortunately, to the point where people ended up leaving. But so it was very difficult to find an apartment. We got Initially we had an agent who was helping us find something, and I think we arrived on a Wednesday. The next day we looked at properties on the Thursday, and out of all the ones we looked at, I didn't really like any of them, but I still ranked them and said, look, just for your reference, this is how I put them. And he said, yeah, that one you ranked number one is already gone, and people paid more than they were asking. And I just went, it actually was a bit of a dump. I don't know, that doesn't sound encouraging. And then the next day, I think we went to our youngest daughter's school. Living in Singapore, we came in with the 3-year-old. We left 9 years later with 3 more children, so 4 in total. And we left with 3 master's programs between my wife and I. And we'd had a lot of travel adventures and all that good stuff. So Singapore was definitely a productive phase of our life, literally, and in all other, ways of thinking about it. Hong Kong was the way I navigated my brain turning to mashed potato was to do more study. And one of those things that I did was apply for the executive MBA at the University of Chicago. They had the Chicago Booth campus here. It was like a really sort of lucky sort of thing to have, the ability to do a US while you're working full time and be able to travel, as part of the program. So I'd never been to the US at that stage. Lived in London for a year in '97, and we moved back to Sydney, and that's when we discovered we were expecting our first child, literally the week that we arrived back in Sydney. And we thought, okay, perfect. We've got our travel thing out of our system. Now we can be suburban Sydney people. But it was 3 years later when we went, you know what, living overseas was more fun. Let's go back to Europe, London, if not Europe. Long story short, we ended up in Singapore, which was actually perfect because it was halfway to Europe if you really wanted to go. Very easy to get back to Sydney or Australia. Low tax, super safe, good for children, all that good stuff. So that's the reason why we stayed longer. Yeah, but doing that MBA got me access to interesting people, like 1 week every 5 weeks for 21 months. And it got me to the US for the first time, which was Chicago. It got me to London because I had a campus there as well. And that's where I discovered, out of that whole program, the big idea that I've been living ever since for the last 16 years was around productive accidents and how does innovation happen. And my extension of that is innovation and adventure are basically the same thing, and they feed off each other and they become mutually reinforcing.
That, if I recall correctly from your book, was an idea that kind of first entered your mind while studying at the University of Chicago, I think around 2010. Also, your book is dedicated to your family, which you mentioned, and you cite them as kind of your source of inspiration and help getting you out of a midlife crisis. So what's the connection between, because everybody gets kicked in the teeth at some point, right? Once you get past like 6 years old, there's always adversity around the corner for any of us. So how has this kind of productive accident philosophy, which may have been partly influenced by your time at the University of Chicago, helped lift you out of this crisis and then sustain you ever since? And the reason I ask is not just because everybody gets kicked in the teeth sometimes, but also because you have this kind of zest for life, which at least around the people I'm around, and I live in London, which maybe, there's a cynicism that's baked into the British experience that means we don't always have that zest for life. But you have this zest for life and energy that makes you see possibilities where I would argue most don't. And if most don't, most can benefit from kind of adopting your perspective. So I'd like to unpack, like, where does it come from and how has it sustained you since you came up with it?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Well, let me explain where the productive accident phrase came from. So I did the MBA just because my career had been quite linear, and it's still, up until very recently, and we'll talk about that later. It's been extremely linear. Accounting, finance, investments, treasury, banking. Or you could just say finance, like the different flavors of finance, but that's what they were. But, in my brain, like I really, in some ways I should have been an architect, right? I looked at becoming an architect out of high school. I did work experience at a financial firm. I did work experience at an architect. And out of the two, I enjoyed architecture. But there were fresh graduates at that firm, and they heard that I had done this work experience at an accounting firm, and they all said, do that. And these are people who just studied 6 years. In Australia, architecture is, pretty serious. It's almost like studying medicine, right? It's a 6-year program. And I started to reconcile with why were they saying that, right? I mean, I think it's because only a very small percentage of architects get to do what they really want to do, which is design beach houses in Bali. The rest of them, a lot of them, drift off to become teachers or photographers or something unrelated. And so I went, okay, do I do a 3-year degree in commerce or economics and with a pretty much guaranteed job? Or do I do a 6-year program and have quite a bit of uncertainty? And so I did the financing. It was probably the right thing to do, right? It was the rational thing to do. But I still had this creative sort of element that I really wanted to pursue. So I did the MBA thinking, look, one day I want to do my own thing. I'm not sure when, I'm not sure what it's going to be, but I should learn a little bit about marketing and strategy and all this other good stuff. And, that's why I did the MBA, just open-minded. But I graduated and I didn't leave Citibank. I stayed with them. I moved to Hong Kong and my role changed and it evolved. And I almost pivoted to do something totally different at that time. And maybe we can talk about that as a sort of a fork in the road, that I'm not sure if I made the right decision or not. But this professor in one of the subjects went back, his name was Ron Burt, he went back 100 years to look at how does innovation happen. And he started with people like Henry Ford and went all the way through to Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, everyone in between. And he was trying to work out what is the common, I guess, ingredients across these people, what made them innovative and so on. And in my mind, I sort of paraphrase it as, they were curious, they had a really diverse network, they had a lot of connections to different industries. And they didn't necessarily invent anything. They just borrowed other people's ideas and implemented them in a better way. Like the MP3 player existed before the iPod, but Apple did a great job of creating an ecosystem with iTunes and a better form factor with user experience and all that other stuff. And so, one of the things that this professor used to show us was this idea of closed networks and open networks and being a bridge between closed networks. So two different industries could be, examples of closed networks. So you could have the fashion industry and banking. And you think, well, there's no real overlap between those necessarily, apart from maybe, needing to having a bank account or something. If you can be a bridge between those two industries, then it gives you sort of a bit of a competitive advantage because you can see what's going on in both of them and you can sort of pick up ideas around technology or business models or, processes, anything. And something routine in one industry can be revolutionary in another if you tweak the idea a little bit. And so that's, to me, one of the main drivers of how innovation happens. And the professor could have just set the exam and said, oh, we're done. You've got the content now, you get the idea. But the gift that I think he did for the class was he distilled all of that research into a single phrase. And the phrase is, put yourself at risk of productive accidents as a piece of career advice or life advice. Put yourself in a situation where something interesting might happen. And it could be luck comes your way. It could be serendipity. It could be happenstance. It could be productive accidents or happy accident, whatever you want to call it. And that resonated with me immediately because it turns out I'd already been doing that in the past number of years. So it gave me the vocabulary to describe something that I'd already started doing. And there were examples around that.
And so what is one productive accident that you had that led you to achieve some sort of success or even just led you to this moment where you're living in Singapore, you have a bike, you've been there for so long, you've chosen to return there and you're really happy?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many examples that, like, I graduated from the MBA program and I went, all right, let's pull the Band-Aid off. Let's get out of Singapore. It's time to do something new. And there were a couple of opportunities. We ended up in Hong Kong and formal study, let's say, had finished, master's degrees and all that. But informal education was still, I was passionate about lifelong learning. And so I pivoted towards things like TEDx. And then I discovered Creative Mornings. Then I discovered Petroculture. Then I discovered Fuck Up Nights. Then I discovered House of Beautiful Business, School of Life, all of these little subcultures. And there was a very active startup scene in Hong Kong and other places all around the world. By that stage, I was the president of the Chicago Booth Alumni Club, again, because I was putting myself at risk of productive accidents. I was being the bridge between these different people and the alumni network. But probably the most blatant first example of me making a decision based on this filter was we joined a sporting club in Hong Kong, the Ladies Recreation Club, and I started playing tennis. I've never played competitive tennis. I played social, and competitive is a different animal. They have a very active tennis league in Hong Kong, the Hong Kong Tennis Association. It runs 5 nights a week. They have A plus, which are almost former professionals, all the way down A, B, C, D, E. And within a month or so of me joining one of the teams, they invited me to be the captain. And because I had a bit of, I don't know, I guess a bit of energy and, I was quite enthusiastic. But my first reaction was go away. I know this is a bunch of admin. I've got a full-time job. This doesn't sound like a good use of my time. But then I paused and I said, well, hang on. Let's just see if this is one of those examples of potential productive accidents. So I said, look, tell me more about the team. And there were 40 guys from all around the world, lots of different nationalities, lots of different industries, lots of different roles and responsibilities, lots of different skill sets. And I said, well, you know what? If I'm going to be true to this idea of productive accidents, I have to say yes. And so I did. And one of the first things I did was, because I was new to the team and the club, I sent an email just introducing myself and sort of trying to form a bond between, me and the players by saying, look, who are you? Where are you from? What do you do? Do you have any children? Where do they go to school? Maybe our children overlap. We've got this tennis tournament coming up, and I haven't played much competitive ever before. Are we going to be at the base? Are we going to be at the baseline, or are we going to be at the net? How do we win a game? And then at the end of that email, I just had a few questions that were like throwaway questions, but they were the ones that created the magic. I said, look, can you just reply to me and let me know, your story, your passions, your hobbies, anything like that. I just wanted to get to know you guys. And within 5 minutes, I had people replying one-on-one, and I got to know them and remember who they were based on their passions. It was a really good hook for me to know people. And the first person who replied, we actually were talking about him even before we started recording this conversation, was this guy called Eddie Gilmert, a guy from Boston, and his wife is from Australia. And he basically told me, look, I'd worked in prime brokerage investment banking for like 20 years during the financial crisis, like 2007, 2008. He pulled the pin on that role, and now he's doing property development in Niseko. And I said, well, what is Niseko? Niseko. He said, look, it's powder snow heaven. It's in Hokkaido, the northern island of Japan. It's powder snow heaven. It's snowboard heaven, all this stuff. And my brain started to go back into my memory of growing up on a BMX bike and a skateboard in Australia. And in the back of BMX Action magazine every month, there was these classifieds. And there was this company called Burton Snowboards that were advertising in a BMX magazine. And I was like, what are these guys doing? But they did a great job. Whoever their marketing people were did a great job. They said, look, if people like BMX, they might like snowboarding. I had never been to the snow because in Australia, it's not a great snow sort of country. And I thought, look, one day maybe we'll go to New Zealand, but then I've heard there's a lot of man-made snow there. Anyway, my brain went into, like my imagination started to get excited about the possibility of, here's a guy who knows Niseko really well. Within 5 emails, we had our first family holiday planned, and that was Easter 2012. And we had a great experience. We went back Chinese New Year 2013. 14, he and his wife by that stage had created a summer camp for children between, let's say, age 2 and 12. They invited our eldest daughter to be a camp coordinator. She was 15. So suddenly she was getting opportunities that may not have appeared if I didn't say yes to being the captain of the tennis team. And we'd been there in winter. We thought winter's amazing, but let's check out summer. We've heard that's good too. And within a week, my wife and I looked at each other and went, like, winter's good, but summer's better. Winter's one-dimensional. It's all about the snow. Summer, you've got golf, mountain biking, camping, hiking, all this stuff. And we started to imagine, wouldn't it be cool if we could buy some land here and build a house? So within 6 months, we'd committed to doing that. We literally sold a house in Sydney because you couldn't get a mortgage in Japan. So we went all in. We had skin in the game. We said, look, we're going to sell that place down there. We're going to buy this place, buy the land, design a house, which got the design thing out of my system from an architecture point of view, perhaps. I mean, my wife loves interior design. And 6 months later, we had a house built in Japan. So 2015, I think we got the keys in September when we were there for Christmas that year. And so we've been going there for the last 11 years, and it's turned into this amazing, family adventure, both in winter and summer. A lot of, like I'm not bad at reverse engineering potential adventures. So my wife would go in and work and holiday for 6 weeks, sorry. So let's say all of July, first couple of weeks of August, she'd take the children and they'd do this summer camp. They'd have a great time. They'd grow up kind of the way we did, like like free range with bikes riding around the community and all that good stuff. I would go in the middle of July, have a week of golf, mountain biking, camping heaven, and then we'd both go and work out of Tokyo. My wife had to be there. You know, she had a team there, so her work were paying for the accommodation. I didn't need to be there, but I did cover Japan as part of my role. And so I'd take my electric skateboard and cruise around Tokyo and I'd commute to work on this board. And even that didn't feel like work. It was kind of fun. And I got to know the team really well. Like meeting people in person makes a difference. And then, you know, deliberately we would end up at the Fuji Rock Festival, which is a 3-day music festival, an hour and a half northwest of Tokyo. It's kind of like the Japan's version of Glastonbury. You know, 2019 was a favorite. We saw the Chemical Brothers, the Cure on their 40th anniversary. Tom York was there. So it's all Western music plus Japanese and everything else. And so we've done that 5 times, you know, and so people are sort of saying, you know, do you even work? Because it feels like you're always traveling. And I've always done self-funded professional development. And that was another productive accident, even how that phrase came about. Anyway, I've talked for a while, so maybe let me pause and see if there's any reflections.
I love that because it's a butterfly effect story, right? So you went to this class with Professor Bird. He captured your philosophy in a phrase, so you already had this philosophy, you just didn't know how to articulate it. He helps you articulate it.
Yeah.
And you suppress your instinct to say, go away, I don't want to do paperwork to the Hong Kong Tennis Club. And you pull on that thread long enough, and you're riding an electric scooter and attending concerts in Tokyo. And the downstream effect
Let's
of
get it
that.
right. Yeah, don't say scooter, say skateboard.
Sorry, skateboard.
Scooter's not quite, you know, my thing.
No,
I'll forgive you.
thank you. The downstream effect of that would be, and I imagine this wasn't your intention when you did it, you did it for the love of just doing it, is that at some point your kids will put that on a college application that they've had all this exposure in Japan, or they'll do a business deal in Japan, or they'll know how to navigate just different cultures.
Yes.
Kind of all because you said yes to the Hong Kong Tennis Club.
Man, I'm getting goosebumps as you're talking, but there's so many layers to this. I mean, we could talk for 5 hours to talk about all of these little productive accidents that happened. That's why I had to write the book, you know, like it's a bit more efficient. And, you know, and I even like that book, Productive Accidents, I had enough content after 3 years of living in Hong Kong. It took me another 6 years to get my act together because I was always sort of like, you know, who am I to think I can bloody write a book, right? I mean, I work in a bank. It doesn't seem to make sense. But the thing that got me there, and again, I need to be careful not to go off on another tangent, but we can talk about how I ended up writing the book later or if it's as a side topic at some other time. But um, just the idea of, you know, the book sort of started with the decision to move from Singapore to Hong Kong. And this is kind of what happened. And then it was so many things happened. It took a while to put a structure around it. Mimicking the structure of Austin Kleon's books. I don't know if you're familiar with Austin Kleon. He's a guy who literally lives in Austin, Texas. And he's written 3 books. I think now he's just publishing his 4th. The first one is Steal Like an Artist. And he's basically saying that nothing is original. You know, everyone is inspired by somebody else. So for me, if I was going to start a band, it would be a mixture of Radiohead, The Cure, and the Pixies, just because, you know, they're some of my favorite bands. And he basically, the way he wrote his book is to have a theme, you know, Steal Like an Artist, and then it's like a subtitle, which is like, I don't know, the surprising, I don't know, something around creativity. And then you'd have 10 chapters, which were like actionable insights with 3 real life examples per chapter. That's pretty much his formula for a book. And I did exactly the same thing with mine. I had to, you know, work out what were those actionable insights. And that's kind of how I wrote it. I just put real life examples in each chapter. And now I've kind of got the reverse. We moved from Hong Kong back to Singapore. I've got the same chapter headings because they're generic. They can apply to any situation. And I've got a Google document with, you know, 10 or 20 bullet points of cool things that have happened since we've been back here already. And I haven't looked at it for some time, but I could definitely write another book. And the next book would be, well, the subtitle for Productive Accidents is A Playbook for Personal and Professional Adventure. And the logic for that is, you know, I want my work and my life, my personal and professional life, to be almost indistinguishable. If you can get it to that stage, work evaporates. You know, to me, that's nirvana. And so adventure ended up becoming the sort of the sweet spot. You know, like, yes, creativity is good, innovation is good, but adventure to me is the engine that fuels everything. And so the next book will be called The Adventure Factory, because I think I guess I've perfected the art of adventure, everyday adventure, and longer form adventures as well.
And so with this adventure can often lead to insights, breakthroughs, innovation.
Yeah,
You mentioned Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Henry Ford, and I think one of the things they have in common might be that they saw possibility where others didn't at a high level, but they connected things that couldn't otherwise be connected, which is what you were alluding to with the banking, the
yeah.
fashion note from earlier. So with your embrace of adventure, what are some either professional or personal innovations that you've found?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is one of my favorite things is instead of having goals, you have systems, so you have a process. And probably this I got this idea from Scott Adams, the guy who did Dilbert cartoons and all that stuff. And he wrote a book called How to Fail Almost Everything and Still Be Successful. So you be playful and experimental. That's my approach to innovation as well. You're also semi-scientific. Like, you have a hypothesis. I think if we do this, it's going to resonate with our clients, or it's going to make my life better. And you create an experiment to test that. And if and you get data, and if the data says yes, it looks like people are willing to pay for this, and you do more of it. If it doesn't, no big deal. You just move on and do another experiment. Creating systems was one of the elements that I think is actionable, right? Creating traditions, family traditions is another. And so I got involved in TEDx, and I'm going to explain how this became a tradition in a minute. But I was MC for one of their events, and then I was helping to curate 15 of their speakers, and 5 of those people became lifelong friends, and they all went off and created a new universe of possibilities and adventures as well. And because I knew Gino Yu, he's the guy who brought TEDx to Hong Kong originally, he would reach out to me just randomly and say, "Hey, it's Tuesday at 5:32 p.m. Are you in town?" And I said, "Well, yes, I am. What's going on?" He said, "Well, we've got this guy," and this is a true story of what happened. We've got this guy who couch surfed his way around the world for 3 years, making a documentary about happiness. We've got a dinner tonight. You should come. And I don't care what's on my agenda that night, I'm going to go to that. Like, I might have calls with New York, I can always reschedule them. I might have a dinner with, something going on. I say, look, this is more important. This feels like an opportunity. So I went along to this dinner and I met the cinematographer, whose name is Adrian Bellick. We're literally having WhatsApps today. And this is like 15 years later. And he turns out he grew up in Chicago on a BMX bike. So for the first hour, we spoke about BMX and brands and parts and whatever. Eventually, I said, "Well, tell me about this happiness documentary you've made. What are some of the insights?" And by the end of it, I was like, "Dude, we need to keep talking. You're a couch surfer. Where are you staying tonight?" And he said, "I'm okay tonight, but tomorrow night, he's looking for somewhere." And on the spot, I just said, "All right, come and stay with us, and I'll work it out." And I went up the escalator in Hong Kong. I don't know if you know Hong Kong very well, but we lived at the top of the escalator on Robinson Road. And I'm going up there thinking, man, I've got to tell my wife that we've got this dude with dreadlocks who's going to come and stay with us for a couple of weeks. How's that going to go down? Anyway, Catherine is cool. So Catherine is the unsung hero, right? Obviously, my wife is there and she's in the background and she's open-minded. She's the oldest of 7 children. I'm the youngest of 6. Somehow that dynamic works, right? And Adrian stayed and everyone, got on really well with him. The next day, I got a copy of his documentary called The Happy Movie. And I invited 20 random people, friends, to come around, have pizza and beers. We watched the documentary. He did a Q&A. And, that's a pretty ad hoc little, the first version of a film festival, you might call it, in our living room. The following year, Adrian was coming back and no surprise, he stayed with us. By that stage, a couple of other adventures had evolved, including a school that we support in Tanzania. There's a Maasai tribal gentleman whose first trip on a plane was to Hong Kong to stay with us. And he was the speaker at a school that fights poverty through education. And so I'd organize an event and he stayed with us. And then we had a musician from Melbourne who, there's a story around how we know Jess Ribeiro. She came in and she played at Clock and Flap, which is Hong Kong's version of Glastonbury. And so within 1 month, we had these 3 really interesting people staying. And what I worked out is, look, it's great that when we have these visitors coming to stay with us, we get to hang out more, we get to know each other better, you get to see what it's like to live in Singapore or Hong Kong. But when I'm not there is where the magic happens, because my children had access to this living library of really interesting people who've lived around the world doing, living lives differently. And, we've got the spare room here, which is where you're going to stay, and your wife and child, whenever you're ready, in Singapore. Like, honestly, on every conversation I have, I point, there it is. We've got people coming here next week to stay with us. Someone that I met at a global speaker summit in Australia. We've already had 2 visitors in the last month from that one event. So come on over whenever you're ready. So I credit, I guess, that approach, having that tradition of people staying with us, to my daughter's. My eldest daughter now has her dream job, and she's the chief marketing officer of a very small boutique travel company called the Explorer Society. And they do high-end African safaris. They do cruises to Antarctica out of Argentina, and she can work from anywhere. So last summer, she worked out of Japan for a month, and she got to hang out with her younger sister. And they are how many years different? They are about 12 years different. And the fact that they can hang out together for a month is rare, as an older child and a younger sibling. And no surprises, we all ended up at Fuji Rock Festival, and that's become a family tradition as well. It's one of the few things we can do together. So last year, my wife and I went to Coachella. This year, my eldest daughter and her boyfriend are at Coachella. Her boyfriend manages a bunch of bands. One of them, Eka Vandal, just released an album and performed at Coachella. And so, music is a recurring theme in our life. Like I grew up, one of the only instrument I learned to play was the drums. And I credit the drums with me meeting my girlfriend, who subsequently became my wife. I performed at a school fete, and 3 days later we were going out. 7 years of due diligence later, we ended up getting married. We've been married 30 years, which is kind of crazy. 25 of those living, actually 26 if you include London, overseas. Only 3 in Australia. But obviously we go back fairly frequently. But even that decision to work and live overseas is obviously a recipe for productive accidents and travel and adventure. Even having one child is an adventure. Having 4 it's another dimension. And so I mean, I think that tradition. I mean, I ended up volunteering at work, taking it back into the corporate setting for the Generations Network. So they have all these internal networks, the Women's Network, the Pride Network, whatever. And I said, look, I would rather be across the top of all of those networks because I can be the bridge across them. But they said, look, we don't do that, but you can be the generations guy. And so I was already doing 3 or 4 events with Chicago Booth as president of the Alumni Club in Hong Kong. And I would bring content or speakers that I discovered there into Citibank as well. So we did a whole series, like an introduction to artificial intelligence. This was like, I don't know, 12 years ago, an introduction to the Internet of Things, the economics of cryptocurrency. We had all these cool speakers that I could, tap and bring in. And so that gave me the energy, and probably, my day job felt like it used 5% of my brain. The only way I could stay in a place like that, in a large organization, was to do all this stuff around the outside, through these creative communities. And yes, I could do the technical work at work, but I got energy from doing the other stuff. And that's what, that's the piece that I'm never going to regret. Because fast forward to January this year, and I've been at Citibank since just before my first daughter was born. And I always remember how long I've been there because I know how old my daughter is, and she's turning 28 this year. So in the 28th year, in January, that Citibank decided, look, we're doing a reorganization. We're going to relocate some of these roles. Unfortunately, your role's been affected. This is on a Wednesday. Your last day is Friday. And so, it took maybe 12 hours to think, oh, okay, this is really happening, because I actually thought my role was going to disappear 2 years prior, because they said, look, we're getting rid of regional roles. I was in a regional role. We're getting rid of the institutional client group, which was just an umbrella. And I was regional institutional client group. So I said, look, that's 2 strikes. That's 70% probability I'm out. And so I had 3 months to think about what is my plan B. And I started out with 3 ideas, and then it became 5, then it became 10, then it became 20, then it became 30, then it became 50. And I distilled it down to, okay, what are the few things I can do with a mobile phone from anywhere? And it was headhunting. It was potentially doing real estate, because I had friends doing property development in Japan, friends doing retirement villages in Australia. A lot of people in Hong Kong and Singapore like to have holiday homes in Japan. They like to retire in Australia. Felt natural. The other one could be adventure travel. Like, yes, I know how to go to music festivals. I know how to go to the Augusta Masters for golf. I know how to go to the FIS BMX and skateboard event in Montpellier. That could be another angle. Photography could be another. So it was all, this ad hoc list of stuff. That's evolved into a longer list, and professional speaking is one of them. And so that's a more recent thing where I've declared that's one of my ambitions. I want to be a professional keynote speaker. And, actually, here's a productive accident that we had already signed up to go to Niseko for Chinese New Year, which was the middle of February in this year. And a week prior to that, I'd been invited to go to a business school classmate's daughter's wedding in Chennai in India. And I had reluctantly declined that wedding invitation because I felt like I can't do Japan and the wedding. It's like a week apart, it feels like too much. And so when my role evaporated, suddenly I went, oh my God, I can go to that wedding. And a 4-day wedding in India is quite a celebration. I'm sure you're familiar. And on the flight over, I don't know if it was altitude or what. I'm on Singapore Airlines. They have really good Wi-Fi. I put a post on LinkedIn where I declared one of my ambitions to be a professional speaker. Within 5 minutes, an Australian guy, Sean McEwen, who is based here, he runs charity auctions for events. He replied immediately and said, "You realise the Global Speaker Summit is coming up in Queensland, Australia, in the middle of March. It only happens every 2 years. You've got to go." And I'd never heard of this thing, right? So within a few days, I'd signed up to go to that, not knowing what was going to happen. 400 people coming in from all around the world, but I have a pretty good sense of productive accidents. If you bring 400 like-minded people together, curious about a particular topic, something cool is going to happen. So I've got 50 new best friends out of that event, and the other 350 aren't best friends because I just didn't get to talk to them. I'm pretty sure all of them were, I was blown away at how the quality of the people, quality of the agenda and the presentations and the whole experience. Like, I've already signed up for Singapore's national event, which is on the 1st and 2nd of May. So it's only a week away, or whatever it is, 2 weeks away. I've signed up for Australia's national event, which is in Hobart in March 2027. I've signed up for the next global event, which is 2 years away in Germany in 2028. And I've got this amazing collection of people where I might end up in Austin, Texas in July to go to one of their events, the National Speakers Association. But all of these opportunities are suddenly just exploding. And yet, I still think it's a tough ask to become a professional speaker. Like if you have to go out and sort of sell yourself, there's a lot of professional speakers out there. So maybe I'll pause, but my next the idea we can talk about later on. How am I going to navigate this sort of dilemma? I want to be a professional speaker. I've got lots of content, but how do you get recognized and how do you get booked? Is like I've got this chasm I need to jump, and I've got an idea of how to do it, but we'll talk about it later.
Well, we could talk about that because, you give me so much rich material. There's so many different directions we could go in.
Yeah.
But since you mentioned it, you mentioned going to Chennai, and
Yes.
What I was going to do was going to ask Peter, the examples you shared are kind of productive accidents landing in your lap, kind of, right? Where somebody asks you, can you be president of the Hong Kong Tennis Club? But I was going to ask, but how do you create your own productive accidents? But you already voluntarily shared that when you put that post about I want to be a professional speaker, people start responding. So given that your career and personal arc is the personification of the virtue and value and reward of productive accidents, what steps are you thinking of taking to cross this chasm? Because I find you very inspiring, credible. I think all the qualities are there to be a professional speaker, but that doesn't mean it's just going to land in your lap. That's not how life works. So what have you thought about generating your own productive accidents to get there?
Yeah, no, it's really good. Yeah, well, I'm going to pivot and then I'm going to come back. So I was in Japan for the Rugby World Cup in 19, and there were a bunch of classmates there that I hadn't seen for 10 years at the time. And I organized a breakfast. So I bring people together. That's one of my, I guess, tools and mechanisms of reconnecting and finding new opportunities. And I described to one of my classmates, I've been doing all of this stuff and, all these serendipity keeps on happening. It's become very predictable and repeatable. And he listened and he said, you know what? What you're describing is also called planned happenstance. It sounds contradictory, but you can plan for something unexpected to happen. And it's a new way of thinking about career, how you create a career. Instead of the old-fashioned way, which is you do a survey and it says, oh, you like numbers? You should be an accountant. Or you like science? You should be a doctor. Very one-dimensional. It's like, no, you should try a whole bunch of stuff and keep following your curiosity or what energizes you. And eventually the dots will connect, but you can't tell in real time. You have to do a lot of things. There's a great talk by Sir Ken Robinson, who gave one of the great presentations on TED around how schools kill creativity. He also did a talk for the School of Life, and it talks about, I think it's one of his child's career journeys, but it's an awesome video. I'll send it to you because it's hosted by Elaine de Botton, School of Life in London. But yes, I'm going to go back to how am I going to navigate this sort of challenge I've got in front of me. So again, I'm going to be inspired by something that I saw that's in a different universe that could be relevant to what I'm trying to do. So I knew a guy, an American guy in Hong Kong, who had written a book about marketing in China. And he was like a Western expert in marketing into China. And he'd written this book and he really wanted to be invited to be a keynote speaker at some of these events around China. And he wrote to lots of events. And they either didn't reply or they rejected him. And so I don't know how he got the idea. I probably should reach out to him and say, look, what was the inspiration? He decided to do the next most obvious thing, which was to create the China Marketing Summit. And by definition, he is the keynote speaker. And so he solved his own problem. And the first year he had 300 people. The next year he had 3,000 people. And it built momentum. So I've got a pretty good network. I've got really interesting people. I've also got 400 people that I just met at the Global Speaker Summit who are hungry to speak at more events going forward. So I want to create my own global speaker event that ambitiously will be 10 times better than TEDx in a different, on a bunch of different dimensions. And I want it to be called the Adventure Factory, which is the name of the company that I set up 2 years ago, in anticipation of my role ending, thinking I want something to be energizing and I want it to be a portfolio of all of these fun things that I do. And I want it to be the flagship event to be in Singapore because in some ways, the Adventure Factory is a reflection of our experience in Singapore. Singapore has become, has been our adventure factory. We came in with one child, we left with four, we left with 3 master's programs. And I want it to be a celebration of Singapore, different to the National Day, which they do, which is very patriotic and very, I don't know, a little bit, well, in my view, a little bit boring, perhaps. I want to come at it from a different perspective, which is from an outsider who's lived here and had the benefit of their governance and their stability and their planning and all their strategic thought and celebrate it from a different point of view. But then I want to export it to 9 other places around the world. And so the dream is Singapore Airlines would be the partner sponsor to bring in these 10 speakers or 9 plus me because I'm already here. I'd love Raffles Hotel to be the first location because it's a signature location and famous for Singapore. And then what other brands are out there? A private bank like Bank of Singapore would be the top priority because it has the name in there. Then you think about, okay, what are the brands that sponsor my favorite events like Wimbledon or the Masters Golf event each year? It's Rolex or BMW or Mercedes. I want, the really high-end brands to think about this as a reflection of their brand and their approach to life and adventure and innovation and creativity. And if now that Accor, the French hotel group, own Raffles, I'd love them to be part of the design team and say, look, we've got 9 other locations next year that we want to populate. Where should we do them? And they'll say, look, we're opening up a new hotel in Lisbon. Let's put a spotlight on that by taking the Adventure Factory there, bringing in the material. We're doing another event in Milan, perhaps, or wherever their hotels are that they want to showcase. But take the Adventure Factory a little bit more literally and you say, look, let's do this speaker event a week either side of some other adventure that is there. So if it's in Tokyo, it might be a week before the Fuji Rock Festival. If it's in LA, it'll be a week before Coachella. If it's in Atlanta, it'll be a week before the Augusta Masters. If it's in Milan, it's a week before Milan Design Week. So we're going to design our own adventure. Work and play are going to converge, and I'll have reached nirvana. So that's the dream. And another friend, because I'm like, okay, if I reach out to Raffles Hotel directly or Singapore Airlines directly, it's operational people. They really can't see the big picture. They can't really put this, they can't see where it fits in their day-to-day work. Another gentleman from Chicago booth suggested, you know what, you want to engage their advertising agencies because they're the ones who are looking for new ways of coming up with something that's going to showcase this brand and this experience. And so I've already reached out to a couple of gentlemen that I found through, again, a little bit of help from Claude to say, look, tell me who are the advertising agencies for Raffles Hotel, for Singapore Airlines, for, et cetera, et cetera. And so I've reached out to one gentleman who founded a firm 20 years ago, and he's super excited about having a conversation. I haven't even told him what it is, but I said, look, we'll put a pin in it, but I have a feeling we're going to make some magic. And so, you plant these seeds and hopefully something's going to stick, but it feels like it's got momentum. I've spoken to people from the Global Speaker Summit, and they said, look, we hear lots of ideas, and most of them are crap. This one feels like it could happen. You know what I mean? Like it feels like there's something here, and it's not like it's just come about. It's like all of these different little experiments have converged to the point where they've started to go exponential. And so yeah, that's what I'm aiming for. The Adventure Factory could also be an online course where people can reflect on these messages, these 10 actionable insights. They can journal in terms of like, how do I come up with my version of these insights? How do I find? And one of the key things is define the causes that you care about. If you don't know what you care about, then you're missing a large chunk of life and potentially. It was a productive accident. My parents brought the biography of a lady who had set up a school in Tanzania that fights poverty through education. That's how I got to know the Maasai tribal gentleman. And I read her book, and at the end of it, I wrote to the founder, Gemma Sissia, and said, look, this is amazing. Keep up your good work. And by the way, we have a mutual friend. And I didn't think she would read my email or see it or reply, but it was like I sent you a WhatsApp. She came instantly back. It must have been evening Singapore time and morning Tanzania. And, we sponsored a child. I got my MBA class to sponsor 2 children. I invited them to come and stay with us, even though we'd never met before. And so this is the example of I'd already been living these productive accidents before I even heard the phrase. Because I invited Gemma to come through here on our way to Australia when she was speaking at a fundraising tour. And we did 7 events in 3 days. And we just made it up in real time. I'm not daunted by, it has to be perfect. We just have to do it, right? I had a friend who had an art gallery. We did 2 evening events. All we were doing is a slideshow saying, look, we are fighting poverty through education. We're lifting this child and this family and this community out of poverty. People are inspired. They want to help. And so every time she comes back through Asia, they'd come and stay with us in Hong Kong. We did 3 international schools. We did an event at Citibank, and then it led to me to discover other charities that were doing things around education. So John Wood, who founded Room to Read, he wrote a book called Leaving Microsoft to Change the World. And we ended up collaborating, and fast forward, he ended up writing the foreword to my book, which is surreal, like that even happened. I went on the board of a charity in New York called Music for Life International. And the first event that I was helping them to promote was a concert at Carnegie Hall on behalf of United Nations and their efforts to end violence against women and girls. And so reading that book about the school in Tanzania led to, this acceleration in my volunteering work. And volunteering, I'm convinced, is a superpower. And people, if you can define what you care about, you can reach out to the organizations that are doing the work that you admire, start a conversation. It's a level playing field. Once you're prepared to help people without expecting anything in return, all things are possible.
Why does that work? Because it's a universal truth I found. And I don't just say that because we both went to University of Chicago, where the part of the culture is pay it forward. So just do it for the pleasure, don't expect anything in return. And I found that to be true 100% of the time. I haven't figured out why the universe rewards you for paying it forward. Have you figured that part out?
There's a great book by a gentleman called Bob Berg, and I can't remember the other co-author, called The Go-Giver. And, like the typical thing is, you want to be a go-getter. But that's a selfish act. You're going to get something for yourself. But to be a go-giver flips it. And it's a made-up story of 3 businesses. I think it's a restaurant owner, a real estate agent, and I don't know, let's say an insurance agent or something. And it's about how they became successful because they were always prepared to help other people first. And then you take Adam Grant, who's taken it to another level, right? He wrote about givers, takers, and equalizers. But by definition, takers win in the short term. But then their reputations are not very good, and you're not going to want to work for them or do anything, unless and then equalizers are very transactional. But then you've got this other portion of humanity, and maybe, we're a minority, I don't know. You're prepared to just be playful and experiment and just sit back and see if you can help. So I'm always introducing people. Like if I have a conversation with someone, I've kind of got a pretty neat structure where I can form a lifelong friendship within 30 minutes. And the way I do it is by listening and say, look, I want to know your story. I don't want to know what you do. I don't really care. Like, tell me your story, your life story, where you grew up, your family situation, the sports you played, the things you loved, the music and whatever. And along the way, I'll ask, and what projects are you working on? What are you passionate about? And it could be a personal project, like I want to write a book, or it could be something at work. And then the final question is where the magic happens, which is, how can I help? And it's, it catches people by surprise. And, like here's someone I've just met and they're prepared to activate their network or their imagination to help. And it started again from a guy from University of Chicago, Patrick IP, who I helped curate for his TEDx talk in Hong Kong in 2013. So he's an amazing guy, worth connecting to, and he's very generous, very good at coming up with great questions. He created a dinner series that became a platform for those three questions. And so I love the format of the dinners. I've hosted, I don't know, probably 20 of them in Hong Kong, a couple in Singapore. When I go to New York, I just throw a message out to this community. There's now 1,700 people who've attended. And I say, look, I'm there for 5 days. I'm free on Tuesday. Someone I don't even know will jump on and say, I've booked a restaurant. 10 people I don't know will converge, and we'll all have that same conversation with each other. And we'll find, overlapping shared interests or causes that we care about, and we'll start collaborating organically. So I've got so many lifelong friends from that. But occasionally I meet people who don't see possibilities and they shut them down before they've even had a chance to breathe. And I've seen it in the last week. And unfortunately, it's been someone from our university. And I'm like, I don't know why you wouldn't even just explore this, to at least see what's possible. But, it just goes to show that maybe, there are different perspectives. Maybe I'm not sure. I typically don't do the whole politics thing. And that's maybe why, I did my work and I had ideas around how I could have activated their imagination in new ways. And like one of the easy examples I think of when you think about innovation and adventure at a corporate level, just pretend that you have two banks, for instance. One of them is very inward, 90% inward, and they engage with the real world only 10%. The other one is 90% outward looking and looking at new technologies and new innovations and new processes that might be relevant. If that's all you knew about these two banks and they were identical in every other respect, which one would you invest in?
One that embraces the new.
Exactly. And then you've got two people, someone who's too shy or too, insular or whatever, to go and say yes to go to Creative Mornings or Petra Kucha or TEDx or whatever. And the other person who embraces all of those things, which one is more likely to have regret?
Who, leaves things on the field, who doesn't
Yeah.
embrace the unknown.
So even if that's all you knew about productive accidents, then you already have a process for making your organization more creative, more innovative, more adventurous, more valuable. And you already have a way of making your life more enjoyable and more complete. That's all you need. Like we could stop there.
A lot of
All
this
these other
reminds me of a book I read a long time ago called The Best Advice I Ever Got. It's by the American broadcaster Katie Couric. And she was asked to give a graduation speech and she didn't know where to start. So she dialed up her network and she asked a bunch of those guys, what advice should I give these new graduates? And one chapter that stood out for me from there, this is around 2010, there's a chapter by Ryan Seacrest. Now, Ryan Seacrest, I don't know about now, but even probably now, but at the time, he had like 7 jobs. He was doing E-News, Oscars Red Carpet, American Idol, all sorts. And he explained that he got to be a polymath of sorts, if you like, in terms of his presence on television, because he said yes. He said always say yes to that cup of coffee because you never know where it may lead. I feel like if there was a physical manifestation of your philosophy, it would be New York City. And the reason I say that is New York City, there's a magic. You feel it when you're in Manhattan. Anything is possible because anything is possible in New York City in a way that's kind of not possible anywhere else. And one of my theories about that is you're cramming about 2 million people onto an island. It's super dense. Everyone's in each other's faces. And that contributes to the chaos, but that contributes to the beauty and to the magic of the place.
I agree.
But at the same time, as much as I love New York City, and I would argue it's the best city in the world, there's a downside to New York where everyone is kind of cranky and miserable. And half the people there are trying to hustle and make it so they can just go to LA and chill once they've made it.
Right.
So with that in mind, I fully embrace the philosophy that you're sharing in this call, in your book, with the Adventure Factory. But what are the downsides of this approach?
So I'm just going to pivot slightly because when we moved to Hong Kong, I found it to be networking nirvana because it's so concentrated. It had density, it had diversity, it had depth. every elevator you're in could be 10 people from different countries, and it just had that variety. I went to New York, and it felt sleepy relative to Hong Kong. I could go to 3 events in one night in Hong Kong on the way home for dinner, by walking up through Lan Kwai Fong onto Wyndham Street, Hollywood Road, go to another event, drop in another one on the escalator, and be home for dinner. I tried to do the same thing in New York. I was at an event downtown, then I went uptown and went back to Midtown. And by the time I got to the Midtown event, everyone had left. So I tried it, didn't quite work because it's pretty spread out, New York. So Hong Kong, to me, had a little bit of a competitive advantage over that. So what are the downsides to doing this? So there's a guy, Derek Sivers. I don't know if you've come across him. He wrote a book called Anything You Want. He's the founder of CD Baby. I discovered him via Amazon saying, hey, people like you might like this book. And Derek Sivers is a really interesting guy. After I'd finished the book, it came with like 1,000 MP3 tracks because CD Baby was a platform for independent musicians. And he gave away one song from 1,000 different musicians. And at the end of reading it, I looked up, who published this, and it was a group called Domino something. And I said, who's behind that? And it was this guy called Seth Godin. And Seth Godin, I started following him. I signed up to his newsletter, and he'd been writing a daily blog for 20 years. And sometimes it's a sentence, sometimes it's a paragraph, sometimes it's whatever. Through that, I ended up doing his Alt MBA, which is a writing workshop, which is like a leadership sales program. And then I did his creatives workshop. And if it wasn't for those two things, I wouldn't have written the second book. And the first book I wouldn't have written unless I did the Patrick Ip dinner series. But Derek Sivers has an alternative view to productive accidents. He says he only says yes to something if his instant gut feeling is hell yes. It's hell yes or it's a hard no.
Yeah.
And to me, I get it. Maybe there's a time where I'll just say, look, I've done enough experimenting. It's time to focus and, but to shut things down prematurely feels not my natural sort of way of doing things. But I can understand, like he's very good at sort of, he locks himself away, and like he published 16 books on one day at one stage. And they were basically a guide to opening a startup across 16 countries. And he had, I don't know, he had 100 questions or 200 questions, and he got 3 people to write the first draft, and then he edited them. One was from a local, one was from an expat, and one was from some third person. And he was able to publish these books in one go. So that took a lot of focus, like to be able to do something like that. So I think there's a balancing act between your hunting and you're searching for new ideas, but then you're also optimizing. There's no way Apple would have been as successful if it was just Steve Jobs, because he's good at coming up with ideas, but execution, you need Wozniak or someone to put that mouse into their device in the garage. So you do need that balance between searching for new stuff and then executing. But you still kind of need to be, even if you're executing, you still want to have an eye on what's happening in the real world, but at least be aware that these two situations exist. And once you've decided, yes, go 100% toward that and execute it as best you can. But, I love the lean startup as another, framework that changed the way I think about a lot of things, because, the old fashioned way of doing innovation was, you've got a budget for $100, build a new product and make it perfect. And then it'll be binary. You push it out into the real world and it succeeds or fails, most likely fails. Whereas, lean startup is, you do a minimum viable product. Hopefully it only costs you $1 and it's crap, but you'll get feedback very quickly on whether someone's prepared to pay for it. If they're not prepared to pay for it, change, do something else, and do 100 experiments. And the distance between what you first thought was going to resonate with your clients and what ultimately people are prepared to pay for is, you can't imagine it unless you go through that, that path. But the best thing I got out of that whole idea was it gives you permission not to be perfect, which is a gift, right? Because we all want to do our best work, and, we don't want to put something into the world unless it's, it's unreal. So I'm going to go back to my daughter, because there's a great quote that she mentioned to me a month after starting this dream job of hers, where, she'd already worked for a couple of startups. One was a sun protection clothing, and then she was a digital marketing place, and then she went to another. But when she got this freedom to design her own life and work and be effective and travel and have all of that all at once, like I'm trying to catch up with her lifestyle, right? She's just spent 2 months in LA as part of doing this album launch and Coachella and everything. She said, look, I didn't think I was unhappy, but I didn't realize how happy I could be. There was this, unknown next level of the game of life that she's activated. And I think everyone has that potential, like whether it's through volunteering, whether it's through playing sport. Like I still do all the sports I did as a child. Like tomorrow, I'm literally going up to, tomorrow or Friday, I'm going up to Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur, to play cricket. I hadn't played cricket for 15 years, but I started again last year. And then I suddenly went down to Perth to the Ashes to watch Australia, England play, and I've got this great group of friends from all around the world, and we're going off to Malaysia, and then I'm coming back, and the next day I'm flying. Well, this won't, my son won't see this, but I'm flying down to Melbourne for his 21st birthday. He doesn't know I'm showing up, but he won't see this, so it's cool. And then I'm going to have a few days in Melbourne, and I've already signed up to go and check out this tennis place called the Royal South Yarra Lawn Tennis Club that Mark Philippoussis, who I met when he came to Singapore last year on a promotion tour for the Australian Open. I've now got Mark Philippoussis on WhatsApp, and all these sort of, surreal little things kept on happening. So I asked the question, like, if I'm going to live in Melbourne one day, because 3 of our 4 children live in Melbourne, what tennis club would you join? And he said, Royal South Yarra. So it turns out my tennis club here, Tangnan Club, has a reciprocal right there. So I wrote to them and said, can I come and check it out? They said, yes. So I've already got that lined up, and I'll take my electric skateboard. I've got another mate who used to work at Vans. He's become a lifelong friend. He stayed in our spare room as well. All of these people that I'm going to converge to, I'm going to a lunch on one of the days called the Uncommon Experience. You get the gist. Like it's a lot, but what is the downside? My wife will probably say, like, just calm down a little bit. There's too much. Just calm down. Maybe that's a downside. I don't know. I don't feel like it's a downside, but some people may not be natural. I'm an introvert, so I don't know if that comes across. I don't know if that comes across, but like if you've got 100-person event, I don't want to talk to 100 people. I want to talk to one. I want to have one conversation that turns into a lifelong friendship. I don't want 100 business cards because I'm not going to do it with anything with them. I'm only going to act on once I know someone's story and I know what they care about, and I know, or I have a way of thinking about how I could help them. I can either help them directly, or I can introduce them to people in my network that, are in that sort of same area, and I'll just sit back and watch. And compound interest is a really, it's an important concept in finance, right? I think compound collaboration is equally as exciting. So I introduce you to somebody like Andrea, our Italian fintech guy in Italy, and you introduce me to somebody else. And then somehow we recombine and we go to another level by creating the Adventure Factory in London. And, you're a speaker at the Adventure Factory in London. You know what I mean? Like, there's stuff we can do to build on all of our projects that we have going here.
I feel like at the start we said that Professor Bird helped you articulate what became, put yourself at risk of productive accidents. I don't know how widely known compound collaboration is. It's the first time I understand the concept, but it's the first time I've heard it articulated that way. I feel like we've just come up with this new insight, compound collaboration, because it's so easy to understand.
Yeah.
It's a universal truth.
Yes.
At risk of using a cliche, like the sky's the limit. Like there's no limit to what you can do if you have that kind of momentum and that compounding that you talk about.
And you just be intentional. Every person you meet, just say to yourself, I want to find where we have a shared interest or we have a cause that we both care about, and then be intentional. Then we're going to decide how to advance whatever that is. We're going to go and play tennis, or we're going to go skateboarding, or we're going to do an event for this charity that we both care about. And so often in these conversations, I'll do at least 3. And if you can do 3, you can do 5. You can do 5, you can do 10. And so then you just have this playlist of things that you can continuously do. We may not see each other for another 2 years, but we'll come back and we'll go, we're back to where we started. We haven't. That's why I'd say, these lifelong friendships can form because you're going deeper, and even better if you can be a little bit vulnerable, right? I mean, you talk about your failures, you talk about, if all you're doing is talking about success, then it's not really interesting and it's not really genuine, right? I mean, we've all had problems. We might as well talk about them, and then we'll find other ways we can help each other. So I've become the host of Distinguished Gentleman's Ride, which is an annual motorcycle ride. It supports Movember, which is around finding a cure for prostate cancer and also mental health for men. Dig beneath the surface, mental health is really how do you prevent people from committing suicide? And, I don't know if, everyone eventually has been affected by someone who's committed suicide or who's died from cancer. So to me, that's a cause that I can get behind. Plus, I can bring in my motorbike adventures, and there's 1,100 cities around the world. So I've become the host for Singapore, but I also put my hand up to be the host for Niseko in Japan because we have a holiday home there. And even though I can't be in two places at once, I can at least find someone who can act as the host for that ride. And then over time, it'll get bigger and bigger and something will happen. So, you kind of understand. And I do talk about compound collaboration in the book as well. It's something I'd been thinking about for a while. But yeah, and just challenge yourself, to do something that is, taking whatever we're doing into another domain or
On that note, a final question. Like, your kind of openness to new experiences, new people, compound collaboration, putting your hand up for all sorts of different things really comes through in your story. On the other hand, you've got a place like India, which I would argue that the entire breadth of the human experience, if it was in one country, that would be India. Wealth, poverty, urban, rural, creativity, language, food, like you go down the list. It's
yeah,
India. And I know
yeah.
this to be true because I asked Claude and Claude confirmed it. And so it must be true. How does somebody with your perspective experience somewhere as exciting as India? Because I don't consider India another country. I consider it another planet, just so different to anywhere else
And
on
Tokyo
Earth.
too. Tokyo is another universe as well.
Yeah. So how does somebody with your perspective experience these places?
So here's a fun example of what happened. We went to the 4-day wedding in India, and at the hotel, we went out onto the poolside one of the afternoons, and there was a band playing Midnight Oil, which is an Australian band. I'm like, what's going on here? Turns out it was the consulate general was going to host Australia Day party, and Australia Day and Indian National Day are the same, 26th of January. Turns out India's version is dry, no alcohol. That doesn't really work for Australia. So Australia, their person had pushed it 2 weeks later, which happened to converge with the wedding. So we went to the wedding, and it's in the evening now. One of the guys from the Chicago booth, it was like a mini reunion for Chicago booth because, it was the daughter of one of our classmates. And this guy tried to gate crash the Australia Day party, and he got rejected. And I just went, well, let me have a go. So I went up and I just walked straight past the reception, straight into the event. I went straight up to the band. I said, hey, guys, can you play some AC/DC? And I don't know if it was a coincidence or what, but they literally started an AC/DC song. And it ended up being all the people converged from the other side of the pool. It ended up being like a little mosh pit. And then later I met the consul general. She said, did you gate crash the party? And I said, yeah. Is that okay? Anyway, she's become a really good friend. And I said, look, you are helping to promote Australian exports around the world. Let's pretend I'm an Australian export. I'm a speaker. Can you help, share my story around the world? And she said, well, I don't even know who the hell you are, all this stuff. So she came in 2 days later and we had lunch and she got a copy of Productive Accidents. And now she's written to me and said, look, I've got lots of feedback, lots of ideas. Let's catch up. So that's going to be in the future. So that's random, right? That's a productive accident, that story. And then the fact that you have a shared interest. And I rented a motorbike as well while I was there. I went up to the T20. I went and watched New Zealand play Afghanistan. And riding a motorbike in any Indian city is kind of sketchy, right? It was full on. Then I came back and I'm following the coastline back to the hotel. And there's a beach with a cement pitch in the middle. And there's two teams forming. They're about to play beach cricket. And I said, this opportunity is too good to be true. I've got to get off the bike and stop and go and I want to play cricket on debut in India. So I still had the motorbike helmet on because I was rushing back to go to a spa appointment. And I said, guys, can you just bowl a couple of balls to me and video it because I just want to capture this. And I sent it to the cricket team on WhatsApp and they said, did they pick you up for the local T20 team? I said, not yet, but it's all possible. So, that was just another funny story, like the motorbike combined with these guys having a game of cricket and opportunistic, right? And it's created a memory. And now, a week from now, I'll be on debut in Malaysia. So it's kind of funny, right? It's an evolving story. But people come back and they say, oh, yeah, I used to play cricket, or I used to go snowboarding, or I used to ride my BMX bike. And I say, well, and then what? If you enjoyed it when you're a teenager, why wouldn't you enjoy it now? Like everything to me should be additive, expanding, universe and all that good stuff. And so I do everything I used to do plus more. And we've just picked up the guitar as my daughter's showing an interest in guitar. So suddenly I'm trying to play out. I've never really learned it properly. But off the back of going to Global Speaker Summit, I had a nephew in Airlie Beach. And I thought Airlie Beach and Cairns in Queensland, they must be like 2 hours away. I can rent a motorbike, go down. Then you do the Googling. It's a 10-hour train ride or a 10-hour bus ride. I said, okay, that's not going to work. So I flew and I hung out with my nephew. And each night, he's a really good musician. He taught me how to play power chords. And suddenly I can finally play my end goal was, can I play Smells Like Teen Spirit? Just the opening part of Smells Like Teen Spirit, I'm done. So now, when I do my opening performance for my keynote, I might play a bit of Smells Like Teen Spirit, and then I'll get the band to come over the top, and then I'll move on to the drums. And they told me it's meant to be educational and entertaining. So I'll ride the skateboard onto stage, I'll pick up the electric guitar, I'll move on to the drums, like all this random stuff you can suddenly combine into the one performance, right? So, yeah, sorry, my
Amazing.
brain.
I mean, that without even experiencing it, that makes for a very memorable speech. I feel like the breadth of everything you've shared convinces me that the P in Peter stands for polymath. But thanks very much. This has been so enriching, as I expected it would be, having interacted with you before today, and being somewhat
And thank
familiar
you for
with your work.
your help as well. Because you know how we overlapped because there's a Better Booth Business WhatsApp chat, and I put something out there about Andrea, I think his business in Italy, his fintech, and you said, is he raising any money? And I thought you were an investor, but no, you're a writer. You want to help him tell a better story, and I'm sure you're helping him with that. I'm not sure if that's how that's proceeded. Then we started talking, and I said, well, I'm trying to be a speaker. And you said, well, tell me what you're going to speak about. And then we started iterating, and we've got this amazing chat in WhatsApp where ideas that weren't there before have suddenly turned into a much better, a much more complete story. So thank you for engaging and saying, keeping the conversation going. To me, that's where, that's a big part of the story here.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure. I'm really excited to see how you channel all these experiences and blossom as a speaker, because I think if you hadn't communicated to me that you wish to be a speaker, I probably would have suggested it by now, because the richness of what you've experienced, I think, deserves a stage. And you could tell it through, video and audio. There's many ways to tell it, but to get the full experience, I think it's got to be in person. Well, Peter, thanks very much. This has been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you so much.